It was supposed to be a quick visit, a simple weekend retreat to an old family property that had seen better days, nestled in the remote wilderness of northern Maine. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, but the memory of thick pine forests and biting winters was enough to lure me back for a nostalgic break from city life. The cabin wasn't glamorous. It was a small, rustic structure built by my great-uncle decades ago, now half buried under the snow that had been falling steadily for weeks. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and barely enough electricity to power a few lights. Just the isolation I craved. I arrived late Friday afternoon, hauling a small suitcase, groceries, and firewood from the trunk of my car through knee-deep snow. The air was sharp, the kind that made your skin sting, and the silence was absolute. Except for the crunch of my boots, it was as though the world had stopped. By the time I unlocked the creaking front door, the sun was already dipping behind the horizon, casting the forest in eerie shadows. Inside, the cabin smelled of aged wood and cold ash. It was as rustic as I remembered: 2 small bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living area dominated by a fireplace. I lit the fire first, shivering until the flames licked at the logs and warmth began to seep through the space. It was peaceful, at least for a while. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling against the wooden walls like some mournful creature. It wasn't until I went to bed that the unease began. The cabin's single-pane windows rattled in their frames as the storm outside intensified. I lay under heavy blankets, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that every creak and groan was just the house settling. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint thud from outside. My first thought was that snow had fallen from the roof. But then it came again, louder this time, a deliberate sound, like footsteps. I sat up, heart pounding. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in a snowstorm? It didn't make sense. The rational part of me insisted it had to be an animal. A deer, maybe, or even a bear. I reached for the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand and crept to the window, careful not to step on the old floorboards that creaked. When I pulled back the curtain, my breath fogged the glass. Nothing, just the dark outline of trees swaying in the wind, their branches clawing at the sky. But as I turned away, something caught my eye. Footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin. My stomach dropped. I hadn't left those, and they were far too large and defined to belong to an animal. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering. For a long moment, I stood in the center of the room, straining to hear over the storm. Then, there it was again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I turned off the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. My mind raced. Should I go outside? Call for help? But there was no signal out here, no way to contact anyone. I had no choice but to wait it out, hoping whoever, or whatever, was out there would lose interest and leave. The minutes stretched into hours. Every so often, the footsteps would return, sometimes close, sometimes faint. At one point, they stopped just outside the window near the fireplace. I thought I saw a shadow move across the glass, but I was too terrified to look. Finally, the storm began to die down, and with it, the sounds outside. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke to weak daylight filtering through the windows. Everything seemed still, almost normal. But when I stepped outside to investigate, I froze. The footprints were everywhere, not just around the cabin, but leading to the shed in the back and even to my car. Worse, they weren't solitary. There were at least 3 distinct sets, overlapping and intertwining as if the intruders had been pacing the property all night. The sight of them filled me with dread. Who had been here? Why hadn't they tried to break in? Or had they? I checked the doors and windows, but everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. Determined to leave as soon as possible, I started packing my things. But as I threw my suitcase into the trunk and turned to get into the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the snow-covered hood was a single word: leave. My hands trembled as I started the engine, not daring to look back at the cabin. The drive down the narrow, snow-covered road was nerve-wracking. Branches scraped against the car, and the shadows between the trees seemed to move, as though something was following me. When I finally reached the main road, relief washed over me. But it was short-lived. At the first gas station, I pulled over to fill up and catch my breath. As I stepped out of the car, something fluttered to the ground, a piece of paper wedged under my windshield wiper. I picked it up, my fingers numb from the cold. It was a photograph of me, standing at the cabin window the night before, staring out into the darkness. The edges of the photo were damp, the ink slightly smeared, but the image was unmistakable. My knees nearly buckled as I turned in every direction, scanning the snowy landscape for anyone who might be watching. There was no one, just the empty road stretching endlessly into the white horizon. I didn't grow up with money. My family never had extravagant vacations or second homes, so when my boyfriend, Mason, invited me to spend a weekend at his parents' mountain chalet, I felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life. The house was enormous, a sprawling A-frame perched on the side of a ridge, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a frozen lake below. It was early February, and a storm had been in the forecast all week. Mason reassured me that the chalet was built for winter, with heated floors and a generator that could last for days. We'd planned for the two of us to stay alone, but at the last minute, Mason's sister, Danny, decided to join us. "You'll like her," he'd said during the drive up. "She's laid back, really easy to get along with." Danny wasn't unpleasant, but she wasn't what I'd call easy. She arrived shortly after us, her car skidding up the icy driveway as snow began to fall in earnest. Her energy was frenetic, her laugh loud and sharp. She filled the silence with constant chatter, stories about her ex, her job, her latest obsession with some online true crime podcast. By the time we sat down to dinner, I already felt drained. The storm hit hard that night, slamming into the house with relentless fury. By the time we finished eating, the snow had piled halfway up the windows. Outside was a wall of white, the ridge and lake completely obscured. It was beautiful in a way, but also suffocating. We settled into the living room, lighting a fire and pulling blankets onto the couch. Mason put on some old movie, but the storm outside was more captivating than anything on the screen. Every so often, the wind would wail, and Danny would flinch, muttering, "It sounds like someone screaming out there." I tried to laugh it off. "Just the wind," I said, "or a snow ghost." "Snow ghosts aren't real," she replied, deadpan. "Well, not until you've had enough wine." It was sometime after midnight when Mason went to bed, leaving Danny and me alone in the living room. The fire had burned low, the coals glowing dimly in the hearth. Danny was scrolling through her phone, the screen illuminating her face in flashes. "You hear that?" she asked suddenly, lowering her phone. "Hear what?" I replied, more annoyed than curious. She tilted her head toward the window. For a moment, I thought she was messing with me, trying to spook me out. But then I heard it too, a faint scraping sound, like something dragging against the glass. It was rhythmic, deliberate. "Probably a branch," I said, even though there were no trees near that side of the house. Danny stood up and moved to the window. "There aren't any branches out there," she said quietly, pressing her face to the glass. I stayed where I was, unease curling in my stomach. The storm was still raging, but the sound of the wind wasn't enough to drown out the scraping noise. Danny stepped back, her expression unreadable. "Weird," she muttered. "See anything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. She shook her head, but something about the way she lingered near the window made my skin crawl. After a few minutes, she sat back down, scrolling on her phone like nothing had happened. I tried to brush it off, but sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept hearing phantom sounds, a tap here, a creak there. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were restless and fragmented, full of shifting shadows and faceless figures. The next morning, the storm had subsided, leaving behind a dazzling, pristine landscape. The snow outside was unblemished, except for a single set of footprints leading away from the house and disappearing into the woods. "Looks like someone paid us a visit," Danny said over breakfast, her tone light but her eyes darting nervously to Mason. "Probably just some hiker," Mason replied, not looking up from his plate. "People get stranded out here all the time." "But we're miles from the main road," I pointed out. "Why would anyone come this far in a storm?" No one had an answer. Mason seemed determined to ignore it. but Danny couldn't stop herself from bringing it up again and again. By afternoon, she had worked herself into a frenzy. "We should call someone," she insisted. "What if they're hurt? Or stuck somewhere?" "Who are we going to call?" Mason said irritably. "The sheriff's station is 2 hours away, and we don't even know if the phones are working after the storm." He was right about the phones. None of us had been able to get a signal since arriving, and the landline in the house was dead. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't as alone as we thought. That night, after Danny went to bed, I stayed up reading by the fire. Mason was asleep upstairs, and the house was eerily quiet. Outside, the snow reflected the moonlight, casting a pale glow over the forest. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The scraping. It was louder this time, closer. My heart thudded in my chest as I set down my book and listened. The sound came in bursts, as if something was dragging across the side of the house. I stood slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stay put. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, drove me to the window. The glass was fogged, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining the dark figure standing just beyond the porch. But then it moved. A flash of motion, quick and deliberate. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the coffee table and landing hard on the floor. "Danny! Mason!" I yelled, scrambling to my feet. "Someone's outside." Mason was the first to appear, groggy and disoriented, clutching a heavy flashlight. Danny came next, her face pale. "What's going on?" Mason asked, his voice thick with sleep. "There's someone out there," I said, pointing toward the window. "I saw them." Mason grabbed his coat and boots. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping out onto the porch before I could protest. Danny and I hovered near the door, straining to hear over the pounding of our hearts. Mason was gone for what felt like an eternity before he came back inside, his face grim. "There's nothing out there," he said. "No footprints, no sign of anyone. You must have imagined it." "I didn't imagine it," I snapped, anger flaring. "I know what I saw." But the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe me. Danny didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. Her expression was enough. We didn't sleep much that night. Every noise, every shadow felt like a threat. By morning, the snow had erased all traces of the previous night's events, leaving behind a pristine facade of normalcy. But I knew better. When we left the chalet later that day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As we drove away, I glanced back one last time, and there, standing in the window, was a figure, watching us go. I grew up in Michigan, where winters are brutal and snowstorms are just a way of life. But no amount of icy winds and blinding whiteouts prepared me for what happened last December. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a weekend retreat with my younger brother, Ryan, at a cabin I had rented on a whim. I'd needed a break. Work had been crushing, my apartment felt suffocating, and I wanted nothing more than a few days of silence in the wilderness. The cabin wasn't luxurious, but it had everything we needed: a fireplace, a stocked kitchen, and a view of an untouched forest that seemed to stretch for miles. Ryan wasn't thrilled about going. At 22, he was more interested in spending his weekends partying than freezing in some cabin with his introverted older brother. Still, he owed me a favor after wrecking my car earlier in the year, so he reluctantly agreed. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, just as the first flakes of a forecasted storm began to fall. The cabin was more remote than I'd expected, nestled at the end of a narrow, snow-covered road that wound through dense woods. By the time we unpacked and lit a fire, the snow was coming down in thick sheets, obscuring everything beyond the immediate clearing. "This place is creepy as hell," Ryan muttered as he set his bag down on the lumpy couch. "Feels like we're in the middle of a horror movie." "It's called peace and quiet," I replied, rolling my eyes. "You should try it sometime." But as the evening wore on, I couldn't entirely shake his words. There was something about the silence here, deep and oppressive, that felt less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. After dinner, we played cards by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. The storm outside was relentless, battering the cabin with howling winds and flurries so thick it seemed the windows had been painted white. By midnight, we decided to call it a night. I fell asleep quickly, the heat from the fireplace lulling me into a dreamless slumber. But at some point in the middle of the night, I woke to a noise. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. It sounded like it was coming from one of the windows. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing tree branches against the glass. But as I lay there, listening, I realized the sound was too consistent for that. I sat up, my breath clouding in the cold air, and strained to hear. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, but the sound continued, relentless and eerie. Slowly, I got out of bed and made my way to the window. The glass was frosted over, but I thought I saw a shadow move on the other side. My stomach dropped. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. Not in this storm. Not this far from civilization. Ryan, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Get up. He groaned from the couch, annoyed. What? There's someone outside. That got his attention. He sat up, squinting at me in the dim light. What are you talking about? I heard tapping, I said, pointing toward the window. And I saw something. He muttered a curse under his breath and got to his feet, shoving on his boots. Probably just some animal. You're overreacting. But as he moved toward the window, the tapping stopped. We stood there in tense silence, waiting for it to start again. When it didn't, Ryan shrugged. See? Nothing. Check the door, I said, my unease growing. He rolled his eyes but obliged, walking to the front door and peering out through the peephole. There's nothing out here, he said, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind felt like a threat. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was letting the isolation and the storm get to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, the storm had calmed, leaving behind a heavy blanket of snow. Ryan was already up, sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee. He didn't say much, which was unusual for him. You okay? I asked. He nodded but didn't meet my eyes. Yeah, just tired. I didn't press him, though his unease only added to my own. After breakfast, we decided to explore the area. The snow was deep, but the forest was breathtaking. A maze of frosted trees and glittering ice. For a while, it was easy to forget the strangeness of the night before. But then we found the footprints. They were faint, partially filled in by the fresh snow, but unmistakable. A single trail leading from the edge of the woods toward the cabin, circling it once, and then vanishing back into the trees. Ryan stared at them, his face pale. Okay, that's not normal. Maybe it's a hunter, I suggested, though the words felt hollow. Or someone lost in the storm. Then why didn't they knock? Why just walk around the cabin and leave? I didn't have an answer. We followed the tracks into the woods for a while, but they seemed to disappear in the dense undergrowth. Eventually, we turned back, the weight of unease settling heavier with each step. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't just at the window. It was at the door, too. Slow, deliberate, like someone was knocking. Ryan, I hissed, shaking him awake. It's back. He bolted upright, his eyes wide with fear. The knocking continued, louder now, more insistent. We grabbed the closest thing we could find, an old fireplace poker and a heavy flashlight, and crept toward the door. Who's there? Ryan called, his voice shaking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice whispered, barely audible over the sound of our breathing. Let me in. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't even human. There was something off about it, a distortion that made my skin crawl. Go away, Ryan shouted, his knuckles white around the flashlight. The voice didn't respond. Instead, the door rattled, as if someone, or something, was trying to force it open. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We locked ourselves in the bedroom, shoving the dresser against the door and huddling together with our makeshift weapons. The noise outside continued, tapping, rattling, even the sound of footsteps on the roof. By morning, it was gone. The snow outside was untouched, no sign of footprints or any disturbance. It was as if nothing had happened. We left that day, abandoning the rest of our things in our haste to get out. I don't know what was out there that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some things aren't meant to be seen.